The straight line from the homeland to today is the one followed by Proto-Bangani. It remained true to itself, whereas Sanskrit has changed. And you see, some people in India won't like this, but you can effectively show that Sanskrit must have changed. That Sanskrit used to be Centum and became Satem. You have a form Jagama.
Jagama.
Yes.
As in to go. To go.
Yes. So you say he went or I went. That comes from a form gegoma, or at least that's what the Indo-European theory says. But it's very logical and defensible.
Welcome back. Now we go to the second stage of our conversation, which will be specifically on linguistic issues. So it is accepted that Hittite followed by Tocharian were the first languages to split from Proto-Indo-European. You have partly addressed it in terms of the gender and so on. So does Tocharian show similar features?
Well, it is, even though it is located at the very eastern point of the spread zone of Indo-European, it seems to be more akin to its western languages, to its western branches. So in the case of Hittite, that's logical because it is located fairly far to the west. In the case of Tocharian, that was a surprise. And so scholars have tried and indeed succeeded fairly convincingly in tracing Tocharian all the way to the west. But again, you see that's not necessary. In this case, it's an area with few contexts, like language context is one thing that helps in situating where the old language was spoken. And it's only known from fairly recently, 7th century AD. But still, I mean, it's a plausible scenario that it came from the West. But it's not necessary, and it can just as well come from India. And it may indeed be used as not proof, but an indication for an Eastern homeland.
For an Eastern homeland, among which I think the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex could be one. Do you think so?
Yeah, that's another unknown. So the out of India version is that the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex from like 2000 BC is not the Aryans just before entering India, but is on the contrary an Indo-Iranian and specifically an Iranian moment on the way out of India.
Okay.
And to my knowledge, there is nothing that pleads against it. And so, of course, it has similarities with Indian and Iranian culture. It should be, because it comes from India.
Yes.
And same thing for Sintashta and so on. So, you see, many people say, yes, you see, the Vedic people came through Russia because in Russia there are certain traces of cultural similarities, but that can be interpreted the other way, especially if you change the chronology. So if things are found that look Vedic in Russia in 2000 BC, some people say, yeah, that's because a few centuries later they enter India. No, a few centuries earlier, the Vedas were composed in India, and then they spread and they came through Russia.
So then, if the actual written sources of Tocharian are so recent, how can it be placed with Hittite in terms of its separation from the Proto-Indo-European language?
Well, because you look at the contents, what has changed. Like, in the case of Hittite, the language characteristics are older. Can be shown to have changed to the language characteristics of Sanskrit, and not the other way around. So, I mean, if you don't believe in the concept of linguistic reconstruction, then you can make that objection. But I think that the idea of language reconstruction has been established quite firmly.
Yes.
So I wouldn't doubt that. I mean, I can look into that, of course. People who know Hittite better. I mean, Tocharian. You know, I know a little because, you know, having studied this Indo-European reconstruction, but I mean, I haven't studied it per se. People who know it better, you see, can perhaps amend the established reconstruction to some extent. But I mean, at this moment, you see, I don't see how that would make a difference to the homeland question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, then between Tocharian and Vedic Sanskrit, which would be older? Clearly Vedic Sanskrit, or since you said it was older than Hittite?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, unlike Hittite, it has more linguistic influences that are traceable to neighboring languages like Altaic, like Uralic. So it has gone somewhat through Central Asia. It must be necessarily. So it can easily have taken those influences. Unlike Hittite, which looks like pure Indo-European. So that complicates matters a little bit. For example, it is a Centum language, which means, you know, the branches can be divided into Satem and Centum branches. And so Satem is the Iranian word for 100, Centum is the Latin word. And on that basis, you see, it used to be said that Centum languages are the western branches, Satem are the eastern branches. It's of course not that simple. One problem is that some Centum languages have developed into Satem languages, you know, have palatalized the pronunciation of k and g. But the word Centum itself is an example of that. You see, the Romans said Centum, but then the later Romans, you know, at the time of the breakup of the Roman Empire, they already started saying cento, like in Italian. So there it becomes setamized. And you get this setamization phenomena all the time, and in all languages. Like in Chinese, you know, some people still say Peking, and so in current Chinese, this is Beijing. So K has become Ch.
Yes.
And like, for instance, in Congo, you have a language called Kikongo. So this prefix Ki denotes a language, like Ki Swahili. And so in the case of the Luba nation, this does not become Kiluba, but Chiluba.
So there is satemization there.
Yeah, satemization there. And so in most language families, you do find this phenomenon. In the European too, and at late stages, like for instance, you have in Sweden words where you write K and you still pronounce ch, like for Norrköping written, pronounced Norrköping. Like Copenhagen, it's pronounced in Swedish as Köpenhamn. So, you know, this phenomenon appears at different times in different languages. So one should be careful to use it. I mean, the old bifurcation into Western Centum, Eastern Satem languages, that has been found to be too simplistic. Now, one element that proved that it was more complicated is precisely the discovery of Tocharian. And so that, you know, far in the East can be explained, And so the usual explanation is migration. It came from the West. However, the out of India explanation is no, you see, it was there. And in India, Centum has given way to Satem, but nearby, Centum has been preserved, so that's Tocharian. There is another example, which is Proto-Bangani. So you have the Bangani dialect of Indo-Aryan spoken in North India. And so it was found that this dialect has preserved a number of words in their Centum form. I think Centum is Koto.
Koto.
100? Yes. And so in this case, it's really a bit well, probably artificial to say, yeah, you see, we can reconstruct a migration that actually they came from the West. Now, there is absolutely no trace of such migration, but who knows, you see, in pre-literate circumstances, it is not impossible. But you see, a more plausible explanation is that it comes from there. You see, that's its homeland. And so the straight line from the homeland to today is the one followed by Proto-Bangani. It remained true to itself, whereas Sanskrit has changed. And you see, some people in India won't like this, but you can effectively show that Sanskrit must have changed. That Sanskrit used to be Centum and became Satem. Like, for example, you have a form Jagama.
Jagama.
Yes.
As in to go.
Hmm?
To go.
Yes. So you say he went or I went. That comes from a form gegoma. And, or at least that's what the Indo-European theory says. But it's very logical and defensible. So this gegoma became jegoma. Why? Because the move from ka to ch or from go to j takes place before frontal vowels, that is to say e and a, and not before back vowels oo, and so, or o. So the g before o, gegoma, that remains, but before in the reduplication prefix g, that becomes j. So you get jegoma, and then you get the flattening of the vowels, a and o both becoming a, which is typically Sanskrit, which is, if you compare Greek with Sanskrit, you often get the same roots, but in Sanskrit, a, o have become a. Or some people in India will say, no, it's Greek that has changed, and the a form are the original ones. Anyway, so the example that I now give pleads for the opposite, that the difference between the J and the Go suggests that the change has taken place in Sanskrit or Proto-Sanskrit and not in Greek or the Western branches. And so, because in Sanskrit, Jagama, you have the A both in the first and the second syllable. So you would expect the consonant that precedes it, that would has under its influence changed, you would expect them to have the same change. You would have Jajama or
Exactly.
Gagama, but not the difference. Well, why do you have the difference? Because you have different vowels there. And so that strengthens the initial intuition that the Greek form, the non-Sanskritic forms are original, whereas the Sanskrit has changed. And so there are some more examples like this. But again, that doesn't prove that Sanskrit is older or younger, because, conservative forms and changed forms exist crisscross in all languages, older, younger. So it doesn't prove that. But it does prove that Sanskrit has changed.
But Sanskrit seems to have been standardized at some point, right? Especially post Panini.
Yeah.
But before that, it might have been in my various registers. That is what you would
Well, of
guess?
course. In fact, it's not just Sanskrit. I mean, the whole Indo-Aryan family comes from a number of dialects spoken in the Vedic age, but it was not just Vedic. Languages far from the Vedic area, like Bengali, must have descended from a sister dialect of Vedic Sanskrit. I mean, in India, it is often assumed that all the Indo-Aryan languages are descendants of Sanskrit. Now, that is precisely the Aryan invasion theory. So first Indo-Aryan came into India in the northwest, and then from there it spread. And so all these others are descendants of Sanskrit. Now, that's not the case. And, many Bengali forms you can't derive from Sanskrit. Changes have taken place. And so you had a whole array of different dialects. Some of them have been preserved and become modern Indo-Aryan languages. So to them, the Sanskrit is not the mother, but the aunt, so to speak. And you can translate the same thing to culture. You see, the Vedic Sanskrit is the language in which one particular tradition was formulated. There were other traditions. You see, there was not one Hinduism. You see, there were many traditions that ultimately together came to form the commonwealth that is Hinduism, and of which Sanskrit became the prominent medium, but not the only one.
Yes. And I think somebody has talked about the great tradition and the little traditions living side by side.
And Srinivas?
Yes, could be.
Yeah.
Could be.
He's the guy of Sanskritization.
Yes, he's talked about Sanskritization. Yes. So that could be it. So that is about the Satem and Kentum languages.
Yes.
And this distinction is not hard and fast. It is not a dichotomy. So to establish a theory, it would be good if it were a dichotomy, but unfortunately, data doesn't support the dichotomy. Kentum languages to the west and Satem languages to the east is not always, without exception, at least. And okay, so based on what you have said, especially the Kentum and Satem, Indo-European has various laws of sound change, like Grimm's law, Rask's rule, Grassmann's law, Brugmann's law. These are the more famous ones.
Yeah.
So can you explain one or two of these and comment on their utility in assessing the IE question?
Where you have difference between two branches, this difference is not random. There is a law underlying it, which is in principle without exception. For example, you have an ancient form pater, a reconstructed form pater, which in Sanskrit becomes pita. This is an example of Voltaire's remark that vowels count for nothing. So A becomes E in this case. But the consonants are more stable. And so once they change, there is a law underlying it, identifiable. So in English, this becomes father, as you know. So what do you see? the final R has remained, but otherwise the initial P has become F, and the middle consonant T has become Th, which then in Dutch becomes de, vader. But so in English, father. Let's limit ourselves to that particular example. So you see that T becomes Th. So you find many examples where the same change operates. For example, the word that is Sanskrit tad.
Yes.
So you see that the T has become Th. You also see that the final D has become T, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this you find systematically that among the dentals, the voice sound becomes voiceless, D becomes T, and the unvoiced T becomes fricative Th. And so all the words where these sounds appear, and that exist both in Sanskrit and in English, will show that same change. So that's a very important stop against all these amateurish attempts to simply relate two words because they sound a bit similar.
Mm.
And I mean, I see that all the time. It existed already long ago. In Yaskas Nirukta, you find lots of it. But you see, to Indians who will protest, you are belittling, Indians and so on. The same thing exists elsewhere. Like a very prominent example is the Kratilos, a book by Plato, which also has lots of it. Folk etymology. And like, for example, a very well-known example in India, the word guru.
Yes.
So you see, so many gurus and other teachers say, oh yeah, you see, gu means dark and ru means light, and the guru is the one who brings you from darkness to light. Isn't that profound? Now, you see, this is this is a folk etymology. The real etymology, guru, is an Indo-European root that you also find in Latin, gravis, from where the English word gravity.
Gravitas.
Yes, and it means heavy.
Mm.
The heaviest planet, Jupiter, is called Guru.
Guru.
Right? So, this problem of folk etymology, I mean, you can laugh at it once you know better, but it's universal. You see, that's the first stage of people starting to etymologize. But so once you know about these sound laws, many of those examples can already be blocked, where you see, okay, these words sound similar, but they aren't related.
So, now given the vast geographical spread of Indo-European languages, it's clear that these people, as they moved around, they would have interacted with other linguistic groups, which would have resulted in borrowings, right? So, given the geographical spread, what do we know about these borrowings from, for instance, Semitic or Sumerian?
Yeah, they're I won't say much discussed, but at least they are controversial. A very well-known example is the numerals for 6 and 7. So in Arabic, still, you have Sita and Saba'a. Now, this Sita becomes Sanskrit Shad, or Latin 6. And the 7, Saba'a, becomes Septem. Now watch out here in Septem, you have a T intervening. Septem, where does that T come from? Well, possibly, and if true, it would confirm the Semitic origin. It is the feminine form, which in Semitic is t. You see, in many Indo-European languages, you have a feminine ending in a.
Yes.
In Arabic, you also have a feminine ending in a. But you see, the sameness of the two is deceptive, because in Arabic, it's not really a, it's t. The feminine ending is t. But in some cases, this is softened and ends up as a. But so in very many places, the t reappears. Like if words are linked, you get the so-called status constructus, in which the word ending in a gets an extra t. Now that t is not a euphonic sound interpolated. No, that's a remnant of the original t ending. So the feminine ending traditionally is in t. And so it might be that t that reappears here in the form septem. And that's part of the whole speculation around it. And it also has people who argue against it. But mostly I think it's still accepted. And it might perhaps make sense because numerals are indeed borrowed. I mean, it's a thing that happens. You would say, well, it's a very elementary vocabulary. How can it be borrowed? Like pronouns, they're also not normally borrowed. But there is a stage in human civilization where numerals were a new thing. So it's possible that people knew how to count till 5. And then a novelty was introduced by the Semitic people, and then others, their Indo-European neighbors, picked it up. So that's quite possible.
Yeah. So this T, feminine T that you talk about in Arabic, is it the same as saying bin for son and bint for
yes, exactly.
daughter?
Great example, yes.
So, okay. But don't we get any kind of borrowings one way or the other in Akkadian or Babylonian from or to Indo-European?
Well, in general, I have to say yes. I do not really, I don't know any Akkadian really, except for examples that I've read elsewhere. So there certainly exists. I can't immediately think of an example. You have the words for wine. And so they apparently come from Semitic.
So we were talking about borrowings between languages. So can you tell us something now about the borrowings from or to Indo-European languages and Kartvelian and Uralic, for instance?
Yes, there are some. Let's start with Europe, writing from left to right, starting from the west and ending in the east.
Okay.
In this case. So in Europe there are no contacts. I mean, there must be. Germanic, for instance, has a serious percentage, once estimated to 30%, now less, but still serious, of borrowed words from what must have been the original European languages. Like, for instance, the word sheep. But so we don't know anything about those languages. And I mean, there are no real European languages left. You see, the Uralic languages, Finnish, Estonian, Hungarian, they came from beyond the Urals, so they came from Asia. And it is mostly assumed that they were always northern languages, from reindeer herders. But at any rate, Asia, and only after that in Europe. And then whether Basque is a really European language is also being debated, you see. long ago I thought maybe, in the European Union, if we want some working language that everybody agrees on, why not take the real European language, namely Basque? But actually, there is research that shows that Basque is also an immigrant language, traceable to the Caucasus Mountains or thereabouts, being related to the West Caucasian languages like Circassian. And one of the popular new theories, maybe popular because it is so heady, is that Basque is related to Northwest Caucasian, to Yeniseian in Siberia, to Burushaski in Pak-occupied Kashmir, to Chinese, or Chinese, Tibetan, Burmese, and even to some Native American languages, the best known of which is Apache.
Okay.
And so that would make a language group spanning from far Western Europe, through Central Europe, North and South, through China, and all the way to Western Canada and down to Arizona. So I like such less probable constructions, but that doesn't make it right, of course, and so some people are also skeptical of this. At any rate, what it implies is that Basque is also an immigrant language, unless Chinese originates in Europe. That's also possible. But so probably Basque is not even a European language. And anyway, I am not aware of any connection between Basque and Proto-Indo-European. There are, of course, borrowings to and fro with French or Spanish.
Yes.
That's much later. So, no. But so, in the East, you have similar questions. This Russian scholar, Tonoyan Belyayev, what's his first name?
Igor.
Igor, yes. Igor Tonoyan Belyayev from St. Petersburg, where there is a Tibetan temple. He's an expert on Tibetan. And so he says that there are a number of words related between Tibetan and Proto-Indo-European. I don't mean Indo-European in general and specifically Sanskrit. I mean Proto-Indo-European. For example, because of course there are many Sanskrit loans in Tibetan. Like for instance, Padma, meaning lotus flower, has become a popular name in Tibetan, Pema. But that's not what I'm getting at here. You have, for example, a Tibetan word, pyugs, meaning cow, which can be related to Sanskrit pashu. But that's Sanskrit, that's not Proto-Indo-European.
Correct.
Whereas this Tibetan word looks like cognate to the Proto-Indo-European word, which has been preserved almost exactly in Latin, pecus. Since cattle was used as a currency and was being exchanged, I buy your daughter and I give you 10 cows.
Right price.
Yes. It's also the source of the word pecunia, money.
Yes. And in fact, in English, we have the word impecunious for poor.
Yeah, right. Okay, so that word pecus, that might be related to pyugs. So not the later Sanskrit form pashu, but the original Proto-Indo-European form, looking like pecus. That would be an example suggesting that Tibetan and Proto-Indo-European were neighbors. And that's exactly the out of India theory. because that presupposes that they lived in northwest India, which happens to border Tibet.
Tibet, yes.
And he gives a few more examples. That's already a few years ago, unfortunately. Us out of India researchers are a very varied company. In fact, most people concerned don't even know each other except through the internet. So he's started doing other things with Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs in Mexico, and stuff like that. So I don't know of any more recent findings, but maybe it's up to someone else like us to continue that work, because if true, it is very important. Yes, it anchors Proto-Indo-European to an area near Tibet.
Yes.
Whereas there is no such anchoring in Europe. None. There may be an anchoring in the Middle East in the form of these apparent borrowings from or to Sumerian or Semitic. And so that needs closer research. There you can find arguments for borrowings in both directions, which would, in fact, fortify the case for closeness. Because if it's borrowing only in one direction, there may be some long distance covering, maybe long time ago there was some ambitious conqueror who went quite far, then all his gains were lost again. We have lost trace because there was no writing yet. So if the borrowing is only in one direction, that is less solid as evidence. In this case, we have borrowings in both directions. So you may never have heard of the theory of, what's his name, Gordon Whittaker, called Euphratic. He says a language was spoken along the Euphrates River in Mesopotamia, which was more or less Proto-Indo-European. It was certainly at that age. And that language underlies Sumerian. It's a substrate of Sumerian. And so in Sumerian, you get a number of Indo-European words. So at one time, this Proto-Indo-European must have been spoken somewhere in West Asia.
Okay.
Now, that theory already dates from like 40 years ago. Nobody has picked it up since then.
Okay. So we have just finished discussing about borrowings from other linguistic groups into IE,
Yes.
as well as borrowings from Indo-European to other linguistic groups that may have been in historical contact with Indo-European languages and groups. So now we come to this issue of hydronyms and toponyms, that is, the names for topographical features like mountain ranges, for instance, and the names of hydrological features like rivers. So these names, change pretty slowly. They persist in a given area even after linguistic replacement in other senses. So, for example, the USA, which is an English-speaking country, still uses variants of Native American names for rivers such as the Mississippi or the Tennessee. So, based on this persistence of hydronyms and toponyms, what can we infer about pre-Indo-European languages in both Europe and Asia?
Well, that in Europe, just like in America more recently, you have a clear replacement of older languages which leave a lot of traces in the river names, as you would expect. And so that's not controversial, we need not go deeper into this. But in the case of India, of course, something very unexpected appears, namely that these Aryan invaders somehow have Sanskritized all the river names in the Vedic area. So There are about 35 that have been listed that are acknowledged even by champion invasionist Michael Witzel. And so, I mean, he's quite an asset to the Out of India cause, in the sense that he quite honestly acknowledges things that are not really in favor of his theory. Like, for instance, about archaeology. He frankly admitted that archaeology gives no proof of an Aryan invasion, even though for a whole century they've been looking for proofs. Well-financed, well-supported research, but they have not come up with anything. And so there's a book from 1995 by Erdősi. I mean, he compiled it, so there are pieces in it by Witzel himself also, where in the introduction he clearly pits archaeology against linguistics. You see, linguists think that they have the proof, or at any rate that they have reason enough to accept the idea of an Aryan invasion, nowadays called immigration. Whereas back then already it's clear that archaeology tells a different story. So in 1980-85, you have several papers by American archaeologists, most notably James Sheffer, that clearly conclude, you know, the expected evidence of an Aryan invasion cannot be found. And so it is after that that Erdősi clearly pits those two against one another. You see the linguistic arguments for an Aryan invasion, I won't say the archaeological arguments against it, but at any rate the archaeological evidence that failed to show up in favor of.
So it is an argument from silence in terms of archaeology.
Yeah, well, so far, I mean, there are more recent developments, but okay, so far, yes, you see, there is total silence on the archaeological front. And about that, you see, Witzel just frankly admits this. You know, it's worth noting because, you know, you very many times, certainly on social media, all the time, you find people saying, no, there is an Aryan invasion because the archaeology says so. You know, nowadays they have the genetics as another argument, but in the case of archaeology, clearly that argument is not valid. And so Witzel says so, but he puts a spin on it. He says archaeology has not shown it yet. So who knows what the future will bring. Anyway, so he lists these river names that are good Sanskrit, that should have been, if the Aryan invasion is true, then many of them at least should have been native, non-Indo-European. Just like in America, some rivers have English names, the Hudson River, but many or most have native names. So here you would expect that too. Now, there are ways to escape this conclusion that clearly there was nobody more native there than the Indo-Europeans that we effectively encounter, the Vedic people. So you could say yes, but the Sanskrit or seemingly Sanskrit names may be folk etymologies of earlier non-Sanskritic names that look a little bit like a Sanskrit word and have therefore been misinterpreted as being the Sanskrit word. And so this happens a lot. And so sometimes you just don't know, like there's a lot of debate about the exact origin of the word Mekong in the river in Vietnam. So this Kong is deemed to be related to Kang, which has become Jiang in Chinese, the Changjiang, you know, the long river that ends in Shanghai. Or the Heilongjiang, the Black Dragon River in Manchuria. So that seems to be coming from Austroasiatic,
Okay.
and so borrowed into southern Chinese. When the Chinese were expanding into Austroasiatic territory, they took over this name. Maybe, but the more interesting part in this context is that that is also seen as the origin of the word Ganga.
Okay.
Yes.
Kong and Ganga.
Yes. So that's not impossible.
Yes.
And so you could give a Sanskritic explanation to Ganga. The reduplication seems to indicate movement, and so ultimately the root is ga, meaning to go, indicating movement, indicating the flow of the stream. You know, that's a case in doubt. You know, we can very legitimately have different opinions about this. And so you could argue that the same thing counts for these Sanskritic river names in the Haryana, Punjab area. For example, the word Sutlej has various forms, Sutudri, and so on. And so these various forms indicate that different dialects have made sense in a different manner of an original sound that they didn't understand.
Okay.
Now, another very eminent Indo-Europeanist, namely Václav Blažek, from, I think, Bratislava, Central Europe. He has, from Prague, anyway, thereabouts. And so he has taken these 35 apart and analyzed them in those terms, you see. Could they be, do they linguistically give the impression of being folk etymologies of more ancient terms?
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, since we don't have these more ancient languages, probably, or they might be Dravidian or Munda, maybe, but so are they that? Now, his conclusion is against that. You see, the vast majority of these 35 do not lend themselves to other than Sanskritic explanations.
Okay. In other words, there is no Dravidian or Munda substrate even though these languages are well known.
Well, these are two different cases. So no, there's no Dravidian substrate there. Definitely not. So you could say that at the present state of research, Dravidian is off the short list of candidates of the Indus language, the Harappan language. You see, maybe the coastal area, you know, the Gujarat coast and so on, there are a few indications of a Dravidian substratum, definitely not in the Vedic area. And in the Vedic area, Dravidian loanwords are slow to come up. And so, given that these language areas are close geographically, they would come up eventually anyway. And so there's no indication that they came up because Dravidian was already in that area. Now, Munda is a different story. You must have heard of the same Witzel's idea that Harappan is para-Munda. It has certain characteristics of Munda, though no specific Munda words are identifiable. And so the idea is that there are a number of characteristics that also exist in Munda. Like, for instance, you have a series of prefixes, And so a good example of that would be the Sanskrit word Kumar, where this ku would be one of the prefixes that have been identified. Could be. But you see, for the case of Munda, there is something else that pleads against it. But again, it's shaky, it's very provisional, but it's interesting. You see, many people try now to solve linguistic questions by means of genetics.
Yes.
And I mean, after David Reich's paper 2018, there were many in India and, in the papers who argued, here we have the proof of the Aryan invasion. And so then I heard terms among these admittedly non-professionals of the Aryan gene.
As if there is a genetic marker for
As
this.
if there is a genetic marker for languages. Now, here in the case of Munda, that is perhaps a little bit more legitimate. Why? You see, all the people today who are Mundas and who have certain genetic patterns that seem to be widespread among that particular population, they are, to a very large extent, real descendants of Munda speakers like 4,000 years ago. Why? Well, you see, if a language is successful, people start speaking that language for a number of reasons. You have, for example, nowadays many small languages that are committing suicide, where the parents start teaching the children in the dominant language rather than in their own little, language, because they want to give their children a better future. I know in Belgium, for instance, there are many Turkish and Kurdish immigrants,
Yes.
Kurds from Turkey. And so many of them not only have a government-mandated Turkish name instead of a Kurdish name, but often you see they have been brought up in Turkish because their parents wanted to give them better chances in life. And so this is happening on a very wide scale. Then there are mixed marriages where, it's more probable that a couple between them and with their children start speaking the dominant one of the two languages.
Correct.
And so on. So there are many reasons why people who don't have the genes, still adopt the language, and therefore, whatever the original Aryan gene was, you see, there are numerous people now who don't have it. The famous black Jamaicans, they don't prove that in Africa they spoke English.
Correct.
They also don't prove that in England they're black. No, you see, they adopted the English language. And so this is what happened with, Hindi in many areas, the Bhils, what was their original language. And many of these tribal groups have been integrated in dominant Hindu society, leaving behind their original language. And so a number of small languages are in the process of disappearing. We've been able to report their disappearance, like Kusunda in Nepal. Okay, now what is the case with Munda? I think it is Chaube from BHU, one of the geneticists that are often cited in the pro-out of India case, who has investigated this and shown that you can clearly identify the Mundas genetically, and moreover, by going back, you see that that population has immigrated.
Okay.
In about 1500 BC, like exactly when the supposed Aryans supposedly immigrated. Only not from the northwest, but from the southeast.
Okay.
Namely from Southeast Asia, which is effectively where the point of gravity of that language group, the Austroasiatic language group is. Now, the biggest of those languages is Vietnamese. So, even though they are now called Adivasi, original inhabitants, they and several other tribals as well are not even Adivasi, you know. So the name Adivasi was of course coined in order to support the Aryan invasion theory, but to give the impression that ancient Sanskrit speakers were already aware that they were really intruders
into an area which was speaking something else.
Yes. So that's a pure propaganda term. Nevertheless, it says something. It says that the Mundas were considered as original inhabitants. Now, sorry, Mrs. President Draupadi Murmu, but you are an invader.
At any rate, an immigrant?
Yes.
Okay.
So the Santals are part of this language family. All strict. Nobody ever had the reason to become Munda speaking.
Correct.
You know, maybe very locally here and there in a mixed marriage it may happen, but generally no. You see, they were not more advanced. They were not the language of success. They were not, dominant. They were also not numerous. Often, even the winners, you see, who become the top layer in society, nevertheless adopt the language of the common people.
Yes.
Because they're so numerous.
Exactly.
And, that is not the case either. So you can effectively conclude that those who do speak Munda at the moment are real descendants of whoever spoke it 4,000 years ago, and of whom geneticists can show that they are immigrants.
Immigrants, yes. And also given the Indian situation, you have the strong tradition of endogamy. Yes. In both tribal as well as non-tribal populations. So it is very clear that these genetic characteristics can be associated with language to an extent. Right? Probably that is disappearing now as travel becomes more frequent and people settle in different areas more frequently. But yes, but the
but that's a very important insight, that endogamy is strong among tribal populations.
Yes,
because you see, in the usual story, it is the ugly, vicious Brahmins who have imposed, the caste system on whoever they encountered, including the tribals. No, you see. It's documented as something very internal to their culture, to which, according to Christian reports in that, tribal area in Jharkhand, that they are very attached to their endogamous tradition, and so they absolutely don't want mixing between the tribes. Yes. Even though they have friendly relations with neighboring tribes, nevertheless, that border is not to be crossed.
Exactly. And I may add that there is a famous instance in which our first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, was inaugurating a dam, and he happened to garland the local tribal girl who pressed the button to open the sluice gates. He was garlanded actually, and so, like politicians do, he took off the garland, and instead of putting it aside, he garlanded her. But her tribe decided that, he had married her, and so she was ostracized because she was marrying a non-tribal, even though by birth Jawaharlal Nehru was a Panditji.
Yes.
He was a Brahmin, Kashmiri Brahmin.
Marrying up.
She's marrying up, and even with the traditional so-called casteist system, the Anuloma marriage, where the woman marries up, has been fulfilled. That condition has been fulfilled, and yet the tribals wouldn't hear of this.
Yes.
Because most importantly, in these instances, customary law overrides all other laws.
Yes.
So that's
interesting example. That's the dam in southern Orissa, I suppose. Yes. Where he also said that, you see, these dams and all these new constructions, they are our new temples.
That was Bhakra Nangal in Punjab.
Okay. Yeah.
That was Bhakra Nangal in Punjab.
Right. Anyways, it's a similar sort of scenario. Bringing modernity to the savages. Yeah.
Yeah, but we are thankful to him for the dams. Certainly, it helped in the industrialization, but that is aside.
Right.
But
but the point I was making was this. So the Mundals come from the southeast. It's very unlikely that it is they who built the Harappan civilization, and they came a bit too late for that.
Yes, because Harappan cities had declined by 1500 BC.
Yes.
Right. And one more thing regarding these hydronyms and toponyms, whether or not they persist is also variable, because in Australia, I don't know if there is that much persistence, because most of them have English British names. Most of the rivers there have British names, and there is no trace of the old Australian language, as far as I can understand.
Well, then I suggest to the Aryan invasion people that they use this comparison.
Because you have to dig deep in order to really find out any, as opposed to the US, where people are still using those languages.
Yes.
So I think it's also a function of how the historical situation plays out.
Yes, of course. In America, there's a long history of treaties with the native nations.
Yes.
And so there was a long time of adaptation in which there was no reason to change the names of the rivers. And so 2 centuries later, the English were totally in power, but they had accustomed, to these native names.
Correct.
Yeah.
So it would go both, either way. So I think we come to the end of this section.